A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at a photo of the Jerusalem light rail the other day, and it struck me how that one train line is basically a moving experiment in sociology. You have people from every possible background crammed into one carriage, but they are living in completely different legal realities. You see a secular tech worker from West Jerusalem sitting next to an ultra-Orthodox student who is sitting next to a Palestinian grandmother from Shwafat. They are all looking at the same map, but the map means something different to each of them. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the people who make up roughly 40% of that city, the Palestinian East Jerusalemites. We have touched on Arab identity in Israel before, specifically back in episode 1260, when we looked at the citizens within the 1948 borders. But this group in East Jerusalem is a totally different animal. They are in this strange liminal space where they are physically and economically integrated into Israel, but politically and legally separated by a very specific and often precarious status. It is the ultimate paradox of the city, holding a document that grants you world-class healthcare and the right to drive to Tel Aviv, but denies you a passport or a say in who runs your own neighborhood.
It is a fascinating and often misunderstood corner of the world, corn. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been diving into the data on this because the legal framework here is what shapes every single interaction in the city. When we talk about East Jerusalem Palestinians, we are talking about roughly 330,000 people who hold what is called permanent residency. This is not citizenship. It is a status that was essentially frozen in time after the 1967 war. When Israel applied its law to East Jerusalem, they conducted a census on June 26, 1967. If you were there and counted in that census, you got a blue identity card. That card gives you the right to live and work in Israel, access to the healthcare system, and social security benefits, but it does not give you an Israeli passport or the right to vote in national elections. You are, for all intents and purposes, a resident of the city but a foreigner in the state. And as of our current vantage point in March 2026, that status is more contested than ever.
And that status is not just a passive thing you keep in your wallet. It is something they have to actively maintain, right? I have heard it described as a residency trap because of this center-of-life policy. If you are a resident, but not a citizen, the government can actually revoke that status if they decide you have moved your primary residence elsewhere. It feels like you are constantly auditioning for the right to stay in your own home.
The Center of Life policy is a massive psychological and administrative weight. Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem have documented this extensively. Between 1967 and today, Israel has revoked the residency of more than 14,000 Palestinians. If a family moves just a few miles east into a suburb like Abu Dis or Isaiah, which technically falls under the Palestinian Authority's jurisdiction or is on the other side of the separation barrier, they risk losing their right to ever live in Jerusalem again. They lose their health insurance, their social security, and their right to enter the city. It creates this intense pressure to stay within the municipal boundaries, even when housing is scarce and building permits are almost impossible to get. It is a tool of demographic management. If you leave for too long to study abroad or work in another country, you might find your entry denied when you try to come home. This makes the identity of a Jerusalemite very different from a Palestinian in Ramallah or Nablus. They are anchored to the city by a legal chain that is both a lifeline and a leash.
So, they are living in the city, paying Israeli taxes, using Israeli hospitals, but they are not Israeli. Yet they are also not exactly part of the Palestinian Authority because the PA has zero administrative power inside the city. It seems like they are the ultimate outliers. When Daniel asks how they identify, is it a case of feeling like they are in a permanent waiting room? Are they citizens in waiting? Or are they a permanent underclass?
That is where the polling gets really interesting and a bit counterintuitive for people who only see this through a purely nationalist lens. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy has been tracking this for years, and their findings often surprise people. In some surveys, up to 40% of East Jerusalem Arabs have said they would actually prefer to live under Israeli sovereignty rather than a future Palestinian state if they had to choose. Now, that is not necessarily an expression of Zionism or a rejection of their Palestinian identity. It is often a deeply pragmatic calculation. They look at the stability of the Israeli economy, the quality of the healthcare, and the freedom of movement that the Blue ID provides, and they compare it to the governance in the West Bank or Gaza. For many, the Jerusalemite identity is a civic one first. They are people of the city. There is a PC-PSR special poll where 75% of respondents said that if their neighborhood became part of Israel in a final settlement, they would stay put rather than move to a Palestinian state. Only 15% said they would relocate. That tells you that the attachment to the physical space of Jerusalem and the practical benefits of the Israeli system often outweigh the nationalistic pull of a future state.
It sounds like a survival mechanism. If you are stuck in a trap, you might as well make sure the trap has good air conditioning and a solid pension plan. But does that pragmatism translate into any kind of political participation? This is the part that confuses me. If they can vote in municipal elections, why don't they? They make up 40% of the population. They could literally decide who the mayor is, or at least hold the balance of power on the city council. Why leave that power on the table?
You have hit on the central tension of their political existence. Technically, as permanent residents, they have the legal right to vote for the Jerusalem City Council and the mayor. But since 1967, the turnout has been near zero. In the 2024 municipal elections, we saw the same pattern. Participating in the election is seen by the vast majority as a formal recognition of Israeli sovereignty over East Jerusalem. To vote is to say, I accept that this municipality is my legitimate government. For most, that is a bridge too far. They would rather have no representation and live with the lack of services than give that symbolic stamp of approval to what they view as an occupation. It is a boycott as a form of national preservation. But the cost of that boycott is staggering. Because they do not vote, the city council is dominated by nationalist and ultra-Orthodox parties who then naturally prioritize their own constituents.
It is a self-fulfilling prophecy of exclusion. They do not vote, so the council ignores them, which leads to even fewer services in East Jerusalem neighborhoods, which then reinforces the feeling that the municipality is a foreign, hostile occupier. I remember seeing that a Palestinian resident, Walid Abu Tayyeh, actually tried to run for mayor in 2024. He was a lawyer, a resident, and he wanted to break the boycott. He argued that you can still be a Palestinian nationalist while demanding that your trash gets picked up and your schools get funded. What happened to that movement?
He eventually withdrew, and his story is a microcosm of the systemic and social barriers. The pressure from within the Palestinian community was intense. He was accused of normalization, or tabi, which is a heavy charge. Then, the outbreak of the war after October 7th made a campaign focused on municipal cooperation feel impossible. When the national struggle is at a fever pitch, talking about sidewalk repairs feels like a betrayal to some. But it highlights a growing generational divide. You have younger East Jerusalemites who have grown up entirely under Israeli administration. They speak better Hebrew than their parents. They work in West Jerusalem malls and tech offices, and some of them are starting to ask if the boycott is actually serving them. They see the disparities every day. If you walk from West Jerusalem into an East Jerusalem neighborhood like Silwan or Shwafat, the change in infrastructure is immediate. The roads are narrower, the trash collection is less frequent, and the green spaces disappear. Moshe Lyon, the current mayor, has made some efforts to increase investment in the East, but when you have a city council that is increasingly right-wing and no Palestinian representatives to push back, those investments often feel like crumbs or are tied to security measures rather than genuine urban development.
Let's talk about that shift after October 7th. That has to have been a massive shock to this delicate pragmatic balance. How did the attitudes in East Jerusalem change when the conflict moved from a slow boil to a full-on explosion? These are people who see Israelis every day at work, but have family in the West Bank or Gaza.
The shift has been profound and, in many ways, quite dark. Initially, there was a surge of nationalist pride in some quarters, but that was very quickly overtaken by intense economic anxiety and a sense of being under a microscope. Security presence in East Jerusalem spiked, but the most telling data comes from the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, or PCPSR. Their polling showed that while support for the October 7th attacks remained high in the West Bank for a long time, trust in Hamas as an organization actually started to crater among East Jerusalemites as the war dragged into 2025. By early 2025, trust in Hamas in the West Bank and East Jerusalem combined fell to about 8.5%. That is a massive drop from the 18.7% we saw in late 2023.
That is a staggering drop. Is that because they saw the consequences and realized that the pragmatic stability they rely on was being set on fire? Or is it a realization that the armed struggle doesn't actually improve the life of a Jerusalemite?
It is both. The economic toll has been devastating. Gallup reported that by 2025, 43% of Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem were struggling to afford food. That is up from 28% before the war. When the tourism industry in the Old City collapsed and work permits for those who work in West Jerusalem were frozen or heavily scrutinized, the reality of their dependence on the Israeli economy became very painful. There is also what I call the Ben-Gvir effect. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, has taken a very hard line in East Jerusalem. In April 2025, he issued closure orders against several Palestinian civil society organizations in the city, accusing them of being fronts for terror groups or the Palestinian Authority. This has created a climate of fear. The Rosing Center did a study in late 2024 that found over 40% of Arab Christians in Jerusalem felt uncomfortable wearing religious symbols in public. They feel squeezed between a rising Jewish nationalism and a more radicalized Islamic sentiment.
Ben-Gvir's approach seems to be the polar opposite of the pragmatic integration we were talking about. If the goal of the residency status was to keep things quiet through economic benefits, his approach seems designed to remind everyone that they are, in his view, a hostile population that needs to be disciplined. It feels like the middle ground is just evaporating. If you're a young guy in Siwan right now, and you see your neighborhood being targeted for settler activity or house demolitions because you cannot get a permit, and then you see the national leaders talking about you as a security threat, where does that lead? Does it lead to more people applying for citizenship just to get some protection?
You would think so, but the numbers do not show a massive rush, which is one of the biggest misconceptions people have. As of 2022, only about 19,000 East Jerusalem Palestinians held Israeli citizenship. That is about 5%. Since 2003, only about 15,000 have even applied for naturalization, and fewer than 6,000 of those applications were approved. The process is notoriously difficult. You have to prove Hebrew proficiency. You have to show you have no security record, and most importantly, you have to pledge allegiance to the State of Israel. For many, that last part is a psychological barrier they just cannot cross. It feels like a betrayal of their history and their family. So they stay in the residency trap. They stay in the liminal space. They are not waiting to become Israeli. They are waiting for a solution that doesn't exist yet.
It is a tragedy of conflicting rationalities. It is rational for Israel to want to maintain sovereignty over its capital. It is rational for the residents to want to keep their health care and jobs. But the resulting system is one where hundreds of thousands of people are essentially political ghosts. They haunt the city's statistics but have no voice in its future. They pay into a system that they refuse to validate with a vote, and the system takes their money but doesn't give them a seat at the table.
And that is why I think they are the canary in the coal mine for the whole conflict. If you cannot find a way to integrate a population that is already economically integrated, then the prospects for a broader settlement look very grim. We actually talked about the physical reality of this in episode 490 when we discussed the removal of the old city line in 1967. Back then, there was this hope that by tearing down the walls you would create a unified city. But what we see now is that the walls just moved inside people's heads and into the legal code. The residency status is a wall. The center of life policy is a wall. The boycott of elections is a wall.
So, what are the takeaways here for someone trying to understand the news coming out of Jerusalem in 2026? It seems like the primary thing is to stop viewing the Palestinian population as a monolith. We often hear the Palestinians want this, or the Palestinians think that. But the East Jerusalemite is navigating a completely different set of incentives than someone in Gaza.
That is the biggest takeaway. Their identity is a fluid, often contradictory mix of national aspiration and intense pragmatism. When you see a poll saying they prefer Israeli rule, do not mistake it for love or Zionism. It is a preference for a functional state over a non-functional one. It is a preference for a blue ID that lets you travel over a green one that keeps you trapped in a village. Secondly, watch the center of life policy. That is the lever the government uses to shape the city's demographics. If that policy tightens or if residency revocations spike, the friction in the city will increase. It is the most sensitive barometer of the conflict.
And finally, the role of the municipality. As long as the city government is seen as a foreign occupier rather than a provider of services, the underlying tension will never go away. The 2024 election was a missed opportunity for a new kind of civic engagement, but given the shadow of October 7th and the pressure from both the Israeli right and Palestinian traditionalists, it is hard to blame anyone for being hesitant. If the municipality continues to exclude 40% of its population, what is the breaking point?
That is the great unanswered question. We are seeing a population that is economically integrated but politically disenfranchised. That is a recipe for long-term instability. Whether those two realities can ever truly merge into a single civic identity is what will determine the future of Jerusalem. We have seen some movement toward integration in the workforce. You see it on the light rail every day, but the political and social barriers are as high as ever. Is it a unified city or two cities sharing a single municipal boundary? Right now, it looks like the latter.
It really puts the unified in unified capital to the test. It is one thing to have the map show one color, but it is another thing entirely to have the people on that map feel like they belong to the same project. It is a city of two realities, and those realities are often in direct competition for the same few square miles of land.
I am not sure we will see a resolution in our lifetime, Corn, but understanding the specific nuances of the residency status is the first step in seeing the city as it actually is, rather than how the slogans describe it. It is a city of pragmatists living in an ideological battlefield.
Well, this has been a deep dive into a very complicated neighborhood. Thanks for the research, Herman. You really dug into the weeds on those polling numbers and the legal history. It helps make sense of why things feel so stuck.
It is what I do. There is always more to the story than the headlines suggest, especially in a city as layered as Jerusalem. You have to look at the ID cards, not just the flags.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives useful, leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps the algorithm find more curious minds who want to look past the surface of these global flashpoints.
You can also find our full archive and RSS feed at myweirdprompts.com. We have over 1,200 episodes there covering everything from ancient history to the latest in AI and geopolitics. If you want to hear more about the history of the city, check out episode 490.
Until next time, keep asking the weird questions.
We will be here to help find the answers. Goodbye.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow